Welcome to the Irish Agroforestry Forum Silvopasture Webinar. Thank you for coming to watch us this evening. This evening we have with us Professor Jim McAdam. He's representing the Irish Agroforestry Forum and Queen's University, and also Dr. Lindsey Whistance from the Organic Research Centre UK. We also have Helen from GrowIN. GrowIN is an organisation in Northern Ireland. It's farmer-led, farmers working together, sharing ideas, promoting innovation, and collecting ideas and knowledge to drive innovation through networking. We also have with us this evening some farmer representatives. We have Clive and Rossa Gibbons, both experienced agroforesters, and James McCrossan from Northern Ireland, who's just starting his agroforestry journey and deciding whether he'll put agroforestry on his farm. Just to let you know how the webinar will run, there'll be two presentations, one by Jim McAdam and one by Lindsey Whistance. There'll be approximately 20 minutes each. We won't have questions during the presentations, but we'll have a Q&A session just afterwards and time for discussion. If you put your questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat at the bottom of the screen, and also if you know the speaker that you want to direct the question to, put their name beside it, that would help us a little bit. If you don't, that's fine. We'll find the appropriate person to answer it. Don't worry if your question is not answered. We are keeping a record of questions and we will post the answers to those on our website, but also on the IAF channel or the IAF channel on the GrowIN website over the coming weeks, so your question will be answered. We won't be taking scheme questions this evening, mainly because we have people watching from all over Ireland, Northern Ireland and mainland UK, and there's different schemes in both areas. Now I'll hand over to Jim for our first presentation, if that's okay.
Thanks very much. Oh, sorry. Okay, everyone, see that okay? Thanks very much, Maureen, and it's great to be able to speak to you all this evening. You've all signed on, you've all obviously got some interest, or you're practicing agroforestry or silvopasture or whatever, or at least you're interested in the role that trees can play on your farm, and that's really, I think, what we're all about this evening. And as Maureen said, we're representing a whole range of organisations, but under the banner of the Irish Agroforestry Forum. The big challenges we know that we face is how can we make farming more climate resilient, and particularly livestock production in this country, which is obviously our main agriculture form of farming. How can we make that more carbon neutral? And one, I mean, there are several routes that we need to go, a lot of things we need to go, but one key strategy to meet this challenge is to really, how can we absorb more carbon on our farms to reduce our net emissions and to enhance biodiversity and water quality? And the route we're really talking about tonight is how can we integrate more trees into our farming systems to deliver those objectives? And one of those potential tools in our armory is agroforestry. What do we mean by agroforestry? I should say at the outlet, I don't like the word agroforestry because it implies forestry in some sense or other, and agro, of course, but then in certain parts of the country, in certain parts where there is an antagonism between farming and forestry, some of it real, some of it perceptive, and really we're trying to sell a system that is not either of those. It's something that's in between that embodies the benefits of both. So immediately if people hear the word agroforestry, some people it immediately gets, you know, they think, is this just a form, another form of forestry that our land is going to be taken away from us or whatever. Whereas really, if you look at the true definition of agroforestry, which is a collective name for land use practice where trees are combined with crops and or animals on the same unit of land, and that's the key point. I mean, if you have a farm and you keep one field in agriculture and grass and you keep the other field in forestry, that doesn't mean you're an agroforestry farm. It's that integration of the two systems on the one unit of land which gives you the ecological and economic benefits between the tree and the component. So in Ireland, where really great grassland is our main land use, and we're interested in getting trees into grazed pasture in some way or other, I think the term silvopasture or trees on pasture or tree pasture, something like that, maybe better represents what we're talking about. But the fact is, agroforestry, the word is out there, and it's a new type of system, and I'll probably refer to it quite a bit. So really, we're talking there about a multifunctional land use option, delivering a range of what we call ecosystem services, that is benefits. If you think of just a simple grazing system where we have an animal grazing pasture, say, there's nutrients been added in whatever form, and there's simple cycling going on, the animal's returning nutrients in dung and urine, it's eating the pasture, whatever it is, and it's growing and it's producing meat. And you have systems going on in the soil which benefit from the animal being there or whatever. But that's a very simple ecosystem, and we know one of the basic principles of sort of ecological management or management of land is that the more complex your system, the more variables you have in it, the more stable it is. For example, if you take our simple farming system, if you put too much nutrients on, they'll end up going down into the soil and into the water course and causing pollution or whatever. Or if you get heavy rainfall and the land's been compacted through overuse of machinery or heavy grazing over a long period of time, then that soil won't hold the water, runs off, and you get problems there. But when you add a tree into that system, you immediately create a whole farming system or a whole ecosystem which is much more stable, because it's delivering a whole range of benefits. That tree has roots below the ground which go way below the grass roots, and they'll absorb any excess nutrients that escape below the grass. It'll encourage microflora, it'll encourage earthworms and other creatures which make our soil much more stable. It'll also help the water to percolate through the soil, in other words, in terms of floods and runoff and things like that. And then, of course, above the ground, the tree is storing carbon, it's providing further habitat for biodiversity, and it's also benefiting the animals from the positive interaction with the tree. And as I go through this talk, we'll talk about all those and the evidence we have that this silvopastoral system provides all those benefits that lead to a much more stable and climate resilient farming system. And here's just a few examples, and these are all from Ireland, of silvopastoral systems that are already in practice, the sort of things that maybe could fit in on your farm, or the sort of systems that we know have been tested, put into practice, and we're happy with the way they're working. Top left there, you have an upland sheep farm in County Antrim, belted Galloway cows running back and forward under sycamore trees that were put in over 25 years ago. Farmer really benefits a lot from the shelter those trees bring, and the fact that the carrying capacity and the length of time he can graze in the season is much longer under the trees. The bottom or the top row there too, you have a couple of pictures near Clonakilty of wide-spaced trees protected in pasture, which is a cut of silage is taken off, and then the animals are put into graze after that to clean up and to graze in the season. Then we have other systems there where we have cattle grazing in mixed trees, with cattle in the middle there, dairy followers grazing in County Armagh, with pigs in a forest in Wexford, with barley there growing in Armagh as well, between rows of poplars, and sheep there as well. Different types of systems, sheep and fruit trees, two examples there, one at Bennett's Bridge in County Kilkenny on the left there, and the top one on the right in some of the orchard ground in Armagh, where sheep are successfully grazing below fruit trees, and you're not wasting the grass that's found there. You're getting an added benefit from that, and you're creating a much more stable system. Bottom left, my bottom left anyway, belted Galloway keys, or belted Galloway in a respaced forest in County Cavan. And then agroforestry really is very suitable for poultry systems. Hens are woodland bird. They enjoy the benefit that being out and the protection that trees bring. And those trees are absorbing the ammonia that the hens are giving off and creating a much more stable system and a much more sustainable food production system. And another example on the right there of sheep in County Down and St. Field grazing under ash trees. If just to go back a step, just to show where we were coming from in our thoughts of introducing silvopastoral systems. About 30 years ago, when I started along the research route, I was asked to try and look at introducing silvopasture into farms in Northern Ireland. The big driver then was grassland sustainability. We were coming through a phase of great grassland intensification from the EEC, and that had created a lot of problems in terms of loss of biodiversity, loss of habitat, water pollution, overuse of nutrients, and really our farming systems were getting way out of kilter, and we needed to look at ways to make grassland more sustainable. And that was the big driver. How can we, particularly on the small farms we have in Ireland, where farmers are very reluctant to take 1 or 2 hectares of land out of production, put it into trees, which would tie it up for a long period of time, and that just wasn't a goer. So we really looked at other models from across the world where you could introduce white space trees into pasture, in other words, continue to farm on the land while at the same time growing trees. And we looked at this model that was being used in New Zealand to control soil erosion, where they had wide spaced, in their case it was pine trees, and they were working successfully in integration with a sheep production system. So we set up a large trial at Loughgall in County Armagh on the Department of Agriculture's land there, now AFBI. And we compared 3 different systems. We compared grassland, a silvopastoral system where we had wide spaced trees, in our case, ash planted at 400 stems per hectare. Okay, I know we know now what's happened is happening to our ash, but we've been going with 30 years experience. I think we've learned that the principles of the system work, and now we can look ahead and introduce other trees into the system. And we compared those with woodlands as well, which with the conventional woodland planting of close spaced trees and with no livestock between them. And we had a properly replicated trial, 3 replicates of each, large enough plots so we could measure animal production and animal output. And this experiment was replicated on 6 sites across the United Kingdom. So the results we found from it from the first 12 or 15 years, while all those sites were operational, were really strong and really sound messages that we could get out. And we got lucky to get funding from the EU, funding from our various government departments. All those other 5 sites have sort of gone by the wayside now when funding has went, but the Loughgall site still hangs on. So we still have now we have over 30 years of data from a silvopastoral system. So we think the messages we're putting out, really show the benefits in the long term that this system can bring. That's just a few shots through the life of the system. We planted those trees, that's in 1989 on the left. Well, that's 3-year-old then, so that's in 1992. We put them in a biodegradable plastic tube to protect them against sheep grazing. Now, of course, we can talk a bit later about tree protection now that we're interested, particularly in getting cattle, getting silvopastoral systems involving cattle, and we need to look at a much more robust form of protection. But at least we showed that we could actually protect trees, and we could create a grassland system below developing trees. I think the bottom left picture shows very much what our objective was. It was to sell this system to farmers, because none of us who were involved in silvopastoral research in those early days were foresters. We all came from it very much from a point of view of trying to sell this to grassland farmers. And that was our key objective. So maybe some of you who are tree specialists, some of you who are good forest will say those trees could have been better pruned at the start. And I agree wholeheartedly. If we had more expert input and support in those days, we would have better trees now. But I still think we achieved our aim of proving that it could be worked with farmers. For example, the farm manager we had at Loughgall was quite happy. He could top the pastures, he could put on fertilizer or slurry, he could do whatever was necessary in normal grassland operations. So our system developed well. The trees grew quite successfully. There wasn't much experience of actually growing trees at wide spacing in pasture before, because most research and most forestry development, of course, you plant trees close together so that the trees push up, grow towards the light, and they create straight trees and things like that. Growing trees at wide spacing was quite novel in terms of the soil, of the fertility, in terms of the nutrition of the trees, and in terms of the type of wood and the quality of the timber. When we got to about year 12 in our system, the trees had grown well, but of course the canopy was starting to close. And then, so we were in the position then of having to make a decision as to whether we let that canopy close and let grass production decline, because that was the first indication we got that sheep output was declining, was 12 years after planting. And that was very encouraging, because that meant, okay, you had this asset which was accumulating, the trees were growing. In those years, we were not particularly interested in carbon. The word carbon hadn't come into the thinking. We were just interested in really selling the environmental benefits of trees on pasture. And so we were able to make a decision then, should we continue to let the tree density increase, or let the tree cover increase, or should we thin out the trees, let light in and let the grass pick up again? We made the decision to actually thin a quarter of the trees, and those were ash. And it turned out that they were extremely popular with the Hurley market. They made very good quality sticks, the springiness of the wood. And we sold then, we raised about €1,000 per hectare from that first thinning after 12 years. So that, economically is very attractive to the farmer. You still had the system, and the grass growth then picked up again, and we continued to have a tree livestock production system from that. Any farmers who visited the site always liked this flexibility, that your land wasn't completely tied up in forestry or grassland. You could make a decision to go one way or the other. Then a few years ago, that's just what the site looks like. We've made 2 other thinnings since, and we're down now to just under 200 trees per hectare on the system. And you can see there's still a fairly good grass sward below that, and there's still there's a valuable asset in terms of the timber growing there, as well as the environmental benefits that the system's delivering. So from a farming perspective, we showed that the system could work, and from an evidence-based perspective, we had sufficient proof from this trial, because we had students and researchers working on it, trying to prove the benefits of all these outputs. And that meant that whenever the Sustainable Agriculture Land Management Strategy in Northern Ireland was delivered in 2017, it strongly backed silvopasture as a land use option to help deliver particularly soils and delivering more soil properties. And for example, in that report, they said in terms of delivering the change that was necessary, that pasture agroforestry used to extend the grazing season, to help higher grass utilisation, and give resilience to grazing during rainfall, while increasing biodiversity and carbon, was really a great benefit to the system. And also it was the opportunity to actually remove phosphate from a greater volume of soil, because there's a big problem in Northern Ireland with over-enrichment of phosphate in soils. So if we think of these, what we call ecosystem services, the benefits that the trees bring, and if you looked at that system, I mean, ecosystem services is really the word which just really means, what do we get from nature, or what does any land use system deliver for us? And you can see immediately having the trees in there gives a huge range of benefits, not just simply the meat, the wool, and the pasture, but also better carbon storage, healthy soil, water purification, fodder from perhaps the trees, more biodiversity, pollinators, flood control, renewable energy, scenery, even a more attractive. Integrating trees into pasture can give you more pleasing landscape. So all these benefits were potentially from the system, and we had proven those as we went through the research that we carried as the trees grew. For example, with biodiversity, we find that under silvopasture, which are the middle bars, the grassland are left, the woodland on the right, and there's the agroforestry system in the middle. In terms of some of the research we did in the early years, more spiders, more birds, more beetles, more pollinators, more worms, and more flora in the agroforestry than the other two systems. So a very positive benefit of silvopasture. Then come sort of by the mid 2000s to 2010 or so, people start to get interested in carbon and look for systems that were much more resilient in terms of storing carbon, and would be able to potentially sequester more carbon than just grassland, because we were starting to concern over climate change and creating more carbon-friendly farming system was coming in. So we managed to get funding to clear fell some of the trees on the site, I think 8 or 10 trees. We were actually able to completely harvest roots, twigs, branches, everything, measure and weigh the amount of carbon in them all. And we found there that the total carbon in the woody biomass in a silvopasture at 21 years old was 77 tonnes per hectare. That meant that over the 21 years, an average of over 3 tonnes of hectare per year had been accumulated in terms of carbon in the pasture. And when you add that carbon stored in the wood and the pasture itself and the soil, you really see at these systems at the potential to store a lot of very long-term and short-term carbon, but in the silvopasture particularly, carbon tightly bound onto soil particles. And our estimates of carbon sequestration from the site were that in silvopasture, in that case with ash and grass, we were able to, a mixed species pasture, we're sequestering about 2.4 tonnes of carbon per year. A perennial ryegrass pasture is typically sequestering about 0.6 to 0.8, maybe 1 at the very best, the high end of the options. So under our silvopasture, we could be sequestering 3 to 3.5 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year in that silvopasture, compared to a forest plantation estimated, that's not within the same trial, but estimated typically those sorts of levels. So the carbon story is a very good one from silvopasture. Also, the resilience to climate change. One of the big challenges we're going to have with climate change are summer droughts, and we're already seeing that. You looked at the drought of 2018, when pasture production virtually completely stopped at the end of July and August, and the significance of that in terms of fodder crisis the next year was obvious, and in terms of hay and silage being made. People said, okay, that's just a one-off, but it'll maybe not happen again. But if we looked at 2019, 2020, once again, the black line is the 10-year average. And for the last 3 or 4 years, every year, our pasture growth, because of low rainfall, has been significantly below the 10-year average. So we're into a situation where we're going to get summer droughts, and that's going to affect pasture growth. Yet under the agroforestry, we've found just by observation that the grass stayed green and and continued to be productive. And we didn't measure, but my thinking in that was because of the reduced evapotranspiration brought about by the tree canopy in the grassland. And we know that having trees that are wider spaced together have more wind firm root systems. And when we're going to get more wind and we're going to get more floods and things like that, silvopastoral system will definitely give us benefits. We find that one of the big benefits of silvopasture is that the water percolates down through the soil, and we measured right down through the whole depth of the soil profile whenever the trees were, I think, 27 years old. And because we'd been able to maintain this trial for so long, and we had that resource, we were able to actually do those soil profile measurements and compare the grazing system there on the outside curve and the agroforest on the inside. And this shows that the agroforest on the outside, this shows that the percolation of water right down as far as about 80 centimeters in the soil is significantly greater where you have silvopasture than when you have just grass. And that means that you're able to keep animals longer out on that pasture and keep them out of the house longer. And over the last 3 years, before I had retired in 2016, 17, 18, we measured the extension to the growing season being approximately 13 to 17 weeks under silvopasture. And that means you have greater levels of grass utilization. You've reduced ammonia emissions from livestock, because we know that when animals are housed in a house and you're getting slurry produced, that's when you get you're getting most of your ammonia produced. Animals outside only produce 6% of the amount of ammonia that animals inside do. So extending the grazing season is one potential way of reducing our ammonia emissions. And with drier ground, you get reduced nitrogen dioxide emissions from the soil, from any nutrients applied to the soil, and of course improved animal health and improved biological soil health. And that really was reflected in the soil moisture under the grassland plots being wetter over, this is the overwinter moisture profile compared to the agroforestry, the bottom, where the soil was just that much drier, and therefore you were able to carry animals longer in the season. Animal welfare is a big issue, and it's increasing in terms of the saleability of the food that we produce. Customers and society in general is more and more concerned about the conditions of which our food is produced, and rightly so. And those who sell that food are going to be concerned when they're marketing food that it's going to be produced under the most welfare-friendly possible systems. And we know it's very hard to measure, quantify animal welfare, but we know that if animals have reduced stress, as they do in agroforestry, for example, here, usually sheep are lying in the shade of trees, and anybody who has a field with a hedge round knows that in the hot sunny days, the animals will seek shelter. And we know that in our, where you have heavy rain or snow, animals will seek shelter. Poultry systems are believed to be much more welfare friendly for animals, and a lot of people, for example, Sainsbury's there market all their eggs as woodland eggs from hens growing, if you like, reared under a silvopastoral type system. Tree fodder is something that Lindsay's going to talk a lot more. It's more her area of expertise, but anybody will know from observations that when you put animals into a field for the first time, they'll go around the side and clean up the hedges first. This is in my own farm, County Down. Some cut down some sycamore branches, and the sheep just polish those off. And this is on another site in Mallow on Maureen's farm, where the sheep were fed some willow leaves and twigs, and they just, you can see they're certainly going to town on those and really enjoying eating those. It's very significant that willow are giving them this benefit, because willow is one of the trees that we know has very good health properties, and the more that animals animals are really do eat them very vigorously, and it's very good for them. And this is another interesting site in County Derry on John Gilliland's farm, where he's doing a trial looking at willow coppice. He has a lot of coppice willow, and he's strip grazing that and allowing some of it to recover each year. But he's doing it on a proper trial where the animal health and the animal performance is being measured eating willow trees. And the animals can fall back on grass, but they've also got the potential, but they're also able to eat the willow foliage. And they're really tucking into that and doing it very well. And there's strong evidence that eating twigs and leaves from trees can reduce methane emissions from ruminants. And we know that that is one of the big issues in terms of reducing ruminant, the impact of ruminants. And there's a lot of research done, a lot of it by Lindsay, looking at different trees. I just picked out one element there, looking at the phosphate content in tree leaves, comparing that with grass. Very favorably, you can see you get as high levels, as many minerals and nutrients as you do in grass. Soil is another key element where we believe that silvopasture can have a tremendous benefit. Soils, we know, are a complex mixture of biological, chemical, and physical components, and a balanced soil requires you to be feeding all those elements of the soil. And there's a lot of evidence worldwide for the benefit agroforestry brings to soil health. All those other things, the organic matter, the fungi, the understory, could be a multi-species sward to deliver more nutritious carbon sequestering fodder. And healthy soils are more climate resilient. Just finish up with a few overviews of sort of establishing agroforestry systems. I showed you some of these pictures already, but you know, you don't have, the time span does not have to be that long. You might have an existing area of forest or woodland that could be respaced, trees could be removed. For example, that top left picture there is a larch plantation that was thinned out. There was grass and clover seed oversown. The sheep were ran back and forward, and over a couple of years, a really good pasture developed under it. They belted galloways there in County Cavan. Alternate rows of trees were removed, the pasture came in and grew in it, and you now have a silvopastoral system developing. And some of those bottom systems there where you're planting directly into grassland as well. The one on the bottom right is interesting. It's Dexter cattle up in County Antrim, where the cattle are introduced, and the trees are being protected by cactus guards. Tree protection is something we can raise, if you like, in the chat, but that's the cactus guards there in a field where the Dexter bull, he's probably pretty efficient at keeping everybody away, but the cactus guard certainly is keeping the cattle off it. So trees can be introduced into a wide range of scenarios in farms. Silvopasture is one, but hedges as well, and boundaries between fields, maybe rows of trees in fields. All of those contain large quantities of stored carbon and sequester CO2 from the atmosphere. And if you can get this interaction of the tree with the pasture at some level, that's going to give you the benefits that were being delivered from silvopastoral systems. How can we promote silvopasture? Well, really, I think we have to promote it no matter what type of support there is, but I think it has to be on a two-pronged system. We want to try and sell the system. It has the potential to be a tree production system, whereby it's a form of forestry, where we can produce high-value trees, which are great value to farming and forestry, or just as a grassland system to produce nutritious, wholesome food, which is much more sustainable and carbon friendly. So I think it's coming from the system from those two angles, and also delivering the support there. But I think key thing really is that we need to try and think outside the box when we're introducing trees into farms, and maybe look back at some past systems and how things were developed and go on. So I've covered all those now, but I'll just finish and say that in terms of sources of support or sources of information, the Irish Agroforestry Forum has been established just over the past year and a half or so, and that acts as a coordinated voice for agroforestry. It's helping educate people, it's helping to promote agroforestry, and it's helping to advise policy in a largely unknown area. And it also links us in with the European Agroforestry Federation, where we get the benefit of a huge amount of advice of a system out there. And then finally as well, this webinar has been hosted as well by the GrowIN project, which is helping encouraging innovation through networking with other farmers and growers, and really looking at regenerative farming, look at farming as a force for change. So I'm sorry I've run over my time a bit, but thanks very much indeed anyway, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Jim. That was a brilliant presentation, and I know I loved hearing the story of the trees at Loughgall, because they were quite small when I saw them last. I was a student and the trees were about 3 or 4 years old when I stood at Loughgall. So some great information there. We'll save the questions, some really good questions coming in the Q&A for after Lindsay's talk, just so we bunch them together. So I'll hand over to Lindsey Whistance now for some more really interesting stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Maureen. Okay. That's it now. Can people see my presentation? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. And thanks, Jim, for that really fascinating talk. So I was going to list all of the benefits with this slide, but I'm not going to now, because I think Jim's pretty much run through them. But I also have a PDF with notes that is available to anybody afterwards if they're interested. So I'll jump straight into the animal aspects of silvopasture. And before we start to really focus on the trees, I want to just start with the animals themselves. And if we think about them, then much of what they do during the day is really based on managing balance, whether that's physiological or emotional balance, and in turn their own health. So in organic terms, we look at health of the animals as their physiological health, their emotional health, and their ability to show natural behaviour patterns, which they then use to bring themselves back into this state of homeostasis. And trees really perform a great deal of benefits for all of these behaviours and maintaining balance. If we think about emotional welfare first, well, in silvopasture systems, animals show less aggression and less fear towards their herd and flock mates. In cattle in particular, their social behaviour is more cohesive and they stay close together as a group. Positive social interactions play a much bigger role in their overall social interactions. And for example, social licking as a proportion of all their social behaviour is nearly twice that of animals on open pasture. So this is 78% compared to 42%, where the rest of that behaviour is more aggressive. And there's also some evidence that they are less fearful towards humans when on open pasture. And we think this is at least partly to do with them having something physical to hide behind. Now, all animals spend part of every day looking after their bodies, maintaining body care. And they do this partly by rubbing and scratching. And in this way, they can remove external parasites such as ticks, and they can also remove seeds, things like that can penetrate the skin. Dead hair can also be rubbed away, as can dust, and this helps to maintain skin regulation and body heat. And if we offer them a variety of angles, then they can use these to access most body parts. And I don't mean to name drop, but I was talking to Adam Henson a few weeks back, him of Countryfile, and he was saying that his sheep, when they have access to scratching posts and rubbing posts, he gets fewer ewes that are cast, so he's got better welfare there. Now, when cattle engage in social licking, the animal that's being licked is much calmer and its heart rate is reduced. And this is pretty much the same thing that happens when an animal is rubbing themselves. So scratching and being licked have similar calming effects on them. And I also wanted to mention this new trend of sheep being selected for self-shedding. Now, it's important that all animals have access to rubbing posts, but this becomes particularly important for those sheep when they're molting. And similarly, poultry, although poultry dust bathe and use their beaks for preening, they actually do more preening under a tree canopy than when they're on open pasture. So Jim has touched on some of these things, but I nevertheless want to mention them, that trees can benefit animals directly and indirectly through buffering the system that they live in. And the top left-hand corner is an image that I took although it's a garden, this is the summer of 2018 in the very dry weather. And you can see that the only green grass in this image is under the tree canopy. And as is mentioned, evapotranspiration helps the grass stay green, but also the reduction in solar radiation. On the right-hand side, this is the ash silvopasture system that Jim mentioned earlier. When you're extending the grazing season by 15 weeks on average, you're allowing those animals to stay outside rather than be overcrowded indoors. In the bottom left-hand image, this is taken in Scotland, and you can see that even deciduous trees with no leaves left, nevertheless still has a beneficial effect on ground temperatures. Now, unlike the cooling effect that occurs in summer, this has a warming effect, and ground temperatures can be up to 6 degrees higher, which makes grazing easier, and it also makes a more comfortable place for lying for outwintered animals. So this is to do with the thermoneutral zones of animals. And the thermoneutral zone is where an animal's metabolic rate is low and where heat exchange is balanced. Now, if you look within the thermoneutral zone, you'll see a thermal comfort zone, and this is smaller, but there's a space either side for thermal behavior. So when the animals are approaching their lower or upper critical temperatures, they change their behavior to modify their local climate to either become warmer or colder, so either seeking shade or seeking shelter, to maintain their metabolic rate within that thermoneutral zone. Note that with both cold and heat stress, heat production increases quite dramatically, whereas with food consumption, intake remains relatively stable within the thermoneutral zone. It increases with cold stress and reduces with heat stress. Now, the increase in food intake with cold stress may maintain production, but it doesn't address the poor welfare. On the other hand, the reduction in intake with heat stress represents both a loss of production and poor welfare. So I've superimposed food intake on top of this. I keep forgetting to put this up straight away, so you can see how food intake goes up with cold stress and dramatically downwards with heat stress. So during cold weather, trees can offer good protection against rain, wind, and cold. And the cold winds have a very strong and negative effect on ambient temperatures. So, for example, with an ambient temperature of 2 degrees and a cold wind speed of 24 kilometers per hour, then the effective temperature becomes -7 degrees. Now, if we consider that cattle that are healthy and have a well-developed winter coat, their lower critical temperature is around 0 degrees centigrade when they're dry. If we then add a rainstorm into this and their coats are now wet, their lower critical temperature increases dramatically to 15.5 degrees. So with this general rule of thumb, that for every 1 degree a beef animal goes lower than its own critical temperature, there is a 2% increase in energy requirements. With this particular scenario, it means that the animal is now needing around 47% extra food. And this is just to maintain it. This is not for production purposes. So you can see that whilst food intake can increase and production can be managed, it doesn't address the poor welfare. And this is similar with sheep. So although sheep are more robust in winter conditions, it's worth reminding ourselves that over 150,000 sheep died in Wales alone in 2018. So we had a very dry summer and then a very cruel winter with the beast from the east and with Storm Emma happening. And the lack of shelter caused 150,000 sheep to die in the exposed areas. And then at the other end of the year, when we consider that we remove their fleeces in one go, their lower critical temperature rises really dramatically to a 28 degrees centigrade. And if we think about when we shear them, which is typically in May, and the average temperature for May is 16 degrees, well, we can calculate that they're going to need at least 20% extra feed. And this is for a dry animal. We don't yet know what the consequences of this cold stress is on milk production and the consequences to lamb health at this point. So that's still to be researched. But what we do know is that with increasingly changeable weather patterns, we're more likely to, or the sheep are more likely to experience more and longer cold stress at these times. Now, as Jim said, trees can be planted on farms for lots of different reasons. And this is probably becoming more of a no-no in terms of tree planting, but lots of Welsh farmers at least grow pockets of commercial trees. And these are used by this farmer for animal shelter. So when he's fencing them off, he incorporates stiles into the fences, and in poor weather, he opens the stiles for the animals to go in and shelter. And really, if you think about it, although biodiversity and other elements are dramatically reduced in these systems, nevertheless, with a deep bed of needles, more like a bed pack system, a canopy which increases both ground temperature and protects against the worst of the wind and the rain, this actually becomes a very effective living barn system that can be utilised and then harvested for a product later on. So one of the biggest causes of death in lambs is exposure to cold in outdoor systems. And we know that juveniles have typically limited reserves of energy to cope with cold stress. And if we think of sheep in particular, then lambs can lose around 10 degrees of heat in the first half an hour of life. And this becomes really, really important. So we know that when we put them into silvopasture systems, we can increase survival rates by at least 30%. And if we plan them in such a way that we keep the ewes within the silvopasture through both ensuring that there's enough, so there's not overcrowding, and also ensuring that there's not too far a distance to water and food, then we can improve the mother lamb bonds. And this also improves survival to weaning. So trying to keep ewes with singles at least one full day, or keeping ewes with multiple lambs at least 3 days in a silvopasture or within the tree shelter optimizes the mother lamb bond. So as important as shelter is for livestock, shade on a global level is the single most important thing that trees can do for livestock and their welfare. And how we offer shade will determine actually how it's used. If we offer too little shade, then we risk loss of vegetation, we risk compaction, we risk animal overcrowding, which paradoxically can cause heat stress, and we risk an increased risk of disease through that overcrowding. So heat stress happens when an animal's heat load is greater than its capacity to lose that heat. Now, I've put up two models that are predictors of heat stress here. On the left-hand side is the old temperature humidity index, which is classically used to measure heat stress. Now, this model doesn't take any animal measures into consideration at all. And as the name suggests, it's temperature and humidity that's measured. And then they look at its effect on production levels. So the animal itself is completely bypassed. With the newer model, the ETIC model, the equivalent temperature index, specifically for dairy cows, they've included more environmental measures, and they've also included animal measures, including skin temperature, core temperature, and respiration rate. And what they found is that heat stress is actually occurring at lower temperatures than we earlier understood. We do know that animals can recover from milder heat stress during the cooler periods of the day, effectively the nighttime. But even here, dairy cows are losing around 3 litres of milk per day through reduced intake. And we also know that the environmental models, the climate models, are showing that into the future we are likely to lose those periods where we've got lower temperatures at nighttime. and we're going to be maintaining heat throughout the night. So these animals, although they're in milder stress, they're less likely to be able to recover from that on a daily basis. So what happens when an animal is more severely heat stressed? Well, really what happens is all of the systems that are non-vital start to close down. So blood is redirected from the non-vital systems, which are the digestive tract and the reproductive tract. With the digestive tract, 50% of the blood that manages that system is moved towards the skin to help maintain core body temperature. When that 50% of blood is removed, the gut membranes then become permeable, and it allows toxins, aflatoxins and mycotoxins to come out of that digestive tract and into the bloodstream, causing an inflammation cascade. And we know that dairy cattle without access to shade have higher levels of mastitis. With the reproductive tract, what we find in heat-stressed animals is that their conception rates are lower, embryonic development and growth is inhibited. We know that cows, when they give birth to those calves, there's less immunoglobulin G in their colostrum, and dairy heifers are both smaller and produce less milk in their first 2 lactations. So these are serious consequences that have generational knock-on effects of heat stress. Now, in the US, they've calculated the economic losses to heat stress. And for the dairy system, hold on to your hats, it's $900 million yearly for the milking cows. And for the beef cows, it is $400 million on an annual basis. Now, of course, this is focusing on the loss of production, but all of this is based on poor animal welfare. Oh, one thing I did want to say, to bring that to a brighter note, what we find with silvopasture systems is that we can reduce solar radiation by 58%, and livestock skin temperature can be reduced by 4 degrees centigrade, helping them maintain core body temperatures. What we also find is that they're more likely to maintain their normal behavioural patterns, which includes eating, and they can maintain production alongside that. And then as an extra, Jim talked about the nutrients. Well, we find that in a silvopasture setting, animals are likely to use the environment much more evenly. So not only are they using the resources available to them, but they're also distributing nutrients through urine and feces much more evenly in that system. So if we consider fodder, well, all of our livestock browse in some form or another, and these are the averages for the annual diet of cattle, horse, sheep and goats. I'm going to focus on the cattle, sheep and the goats here. So for the cattle, the annual intake is 12%, for sheep it's 20%, and for goats it's 60%. But this can fluctuate quite dramatically, and this might be early spring when palatability is very high, or it might be in drought situations where there is very little green grass available. And here we find that cattle can increase their browse intake up to 55% of total intake, sheep 76%, and for goats a whopping 93%. And it's worth also considering actually what they prefer to eat, so looking at palatability. And this was done in Scotland, so there are quite a few trees missing off this list. But nevertheless, it indicates that there's a real difference in their willingness to browse different species. I also want to point out here that palatability isn't just the simple hedonistic sensation of taste. It's really quite a sophisticated system of the sensations, predominantly taste, but also a little bit of smell, and also post-ingestive feedback, and that's chemical and mechanical. If we take an example of lambs that were deliberately given too little vitamin E, and then they were offered different choices of feed, some that was high in vitamin E but pretty poor on palatability, they found that the lambs that were made deficient in vitamin E were immediately switched their preference to the food that was high in vitamin E until they had recovered their levels of vitamin E, whereupon they switched back to the more palatable food. Now, the people that did this research noticed that the switch to the high vitamin E food happened before there were any clinical signs of deficiency. So their change and their preferences, or the feedback mechanism, was sufficiently sensitive for them to be able to rescue themselves, if you like, in terms of nutrient deficiency before that became a disease state. And one thing I just also wanted to point out, that cattle are typically categorized as non-selective browsers and grazers, but when they have the option to do so, they can also select different food types. So in terms of nutrition, I should come clean and say that this is a piece of research that was actually done in 1917 on trees that were fed in a Swedish farming system. Now, it doesn't matter that it was done that long ago, because the basic message still holds true, that leaf nutrition is pretty comparable to grasses and forbs grown in the same environment. So here it's compared to meadow hay and red clover. Now, I'm not going to go into detail here, but actually across the board, I think apart from 2 species, all of the trees are better in terms of fat, sugar and protein compared to red clover and meadow hay in the same environment. I do want to point out that these trees are selected not for animal preferences, but for what was available to the farmers. They did note that the grey alder was very low in palatability and that the ash was high in palatability, but they typically managed them in such a way that they would feed the least palatable at the beginning of the winter and the most palatable at the end of the winter. So that's how they got the animals to eat most of these things. In a UK setting, the trees that were used traditionally for tree fodder were ash and elm and holly, particularly for browsing sheep, but not exclusively for sheep. So this is a bit more up to date and is to do with crude protein and available protein in tree fodder, and again reference to alfalfa and ryegrass. So the tree fodder compares again very, very well, but the outstanding on all levels is the mulberry, very, very high in proteins. If you live in an area where you can grow mulberry bushes, they are highly productive as well. And there's a video somewhere, a YouTube video somewhere with a French farmer who talks about the tons of mulberry tree fodder that he harvests every year for feeding his cattle. One of the other things that tree fodder is very good for that grasses don't have is the condensed tannins. Now, we know that condensed tannins enable rumen bypass protein, so they're preventing the protein from being digested in the rumen, but when it hits the more acidic abomasum, then the bonds are broken down, effectively delivering high quality protein to the intestine. And the other thing that these condensed tannins do is reduce methane production. So we know that the methane produced from willow is less than half that from the alfalfa. Perhaps more so than macronutrients, trees are a very good source of micronutrients and particularly minerals. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I have pointed out some minerals. So, for example, the goat willow is a very good source of calcium and phosphorus. The osier willow is an exceptional source for zinc. And although I keep saying that alder is poor in palatability, it keeps being analysed because it's a very good nitrogen fixer. So you see on the top left-hand corner the high levels of nitrogen. It's actually quite good in terms of nutrient content. So something is going on that makes this tree a relatively unpalatable source of food. The other thing I wanted to point out with this piece of research is that the tree fodder was harvested in the summer and analysed, and then fed as tree hay the following March and analysed once more. And what we found was the level of minerals had increased. The proportion of minerals had actually increased during that time. And this is really interesting because it may provide a source of minerals that is more sustainable. So we're not mining and harvesting finite sources of minerals for our livestock. And it perhaps gives it a life beyond its own season and an increased value over time. This is another piece of research which we've done more recently, published in 2021. And we were looking specifically at different species over seasons and over places to see whether they could offer minerals for lambs, particularly growing lambs. So the top line is the straight black line going across is the upper nutrient requirements, and the dashed line is the lower nutrient requirements for sheep. So we tested oak, willow and alder across 3 different areas, which were Berkshire, Leicestershire and North Wales. And you can see here, I mean, willow is outstanding, but also oak and alder produce cobalt. And this is particularly of interest for growing lambs when they're being weaned, and the level of cobalt in pasture is going down quite dramatically. So this represents a very good and resilient sustainable source of cobalt for them. Here we have selenium, and you can see the dark lines are the summer and the paler lines are the autumn sampling. So for some reason the oak tree in Berkshire, this is actually on Elm Farm, which was the Organic Research Centre at the time, is very, very high. So perhaps dairy farmers might be interested in looking at this too. But again, willow, again high. For zinc, I mentioned osier willow being very high in zinc. This is goat willow, so also a very good source of zinc. And the final one, iodine. So it looks as if oak is the better source of zinc, and particularly later in the year. But again, willow and alder largely producing sufficient iodine for growing lambs. If we think about how we feed the animals, well, direct browsing is the most obvious, and they are more than willing to do this. But we need then to understand browsing heights. So for sheep, that's around 1.2 meters. For cattle, it's 2 meters. And for goats, it's essentially non-existent. They're considered to be vertical browsers and prefer to effectively strip one plant before they move on to the next one. But note that these are maximum heights, and this is some short rotation coppice that was browsed by lambs that were almost finished, and you can see their browsing preference was about 65, 70 centimeters height. If we don't want to feed fresh browse, there are other ways of feeding. So the top left-hand corner is a silvopasture system in Berkshire, where the farmer has a very long established silvopasture system which he harvests for wood burning fuel. So he cuts the branches, allows the sheep to browse them fresh, and once the branches are cleaned, he cuts them up and harvests them or stores them for drying. Cutting and carrying and feeding fresh is typically a system for smaller numbers of animals, works very well for small groups. Or we can cut and dry, or cut and silage for feeding later. And this is a trailer of tree hay, which is going to be fed to some dairy goats in Belgium. It's worth noting that if you dry as tree hay, then you lose the condensed tannin content. That reduces quite dramatically. If you ensile it, then you maintain the condensed tannin content. If you do manage trees for tree fodder or browse, then it will typically require some kind of management, ensuring either that the animals have access, direct access to the trees, or in fact ensuring that they don't. So making sure that that canopy height is at the right height for the purposes that you want. And the last thing I want to mention, of course, is the medicinal aspect. So I'm not going to go into this too much, but there's a lot of discussion about whether animals can self-medicate. There is increasing evidence that they can do that. But perhaps disturbing image on the left-hand side shows a steer that's been kept on moorland, which is both calcium and phosphorus poor. It's found a source of calcium and phosphorus in the bones of a dead rabbit. And this indicates really strongly that the animals have a sense that they need to go looking for a food source to repair those losses in nutrients. The larger image of the sheep browsing on willow, Jim mentioned earlier that they're very keen to browse on willow. Well, this indicates a trial that was done with sheep and different species of willow that had different levels of salicin. Now, salicin is the precursor of aspirin, so we know it as a painkiller, but it has antipyretic properties, has antimicrobial properties. It's a fungicide also, so it has a great deal of medical benefits aside from being a painkiller. And when these sheep were offered these different varieties with differing levels of salicin in them, they went straight to the one with the highest levels in, and they stripped that before they started to strip the others with lower levels. Now, the authors of that particular piece of research don't know why they did that, because they didn't monitor health or other things. They just monitored preference. But the fact that they were able to, if you like, know the difference between salicin content is very revealing that they are able to select and to prefer different contents of nutrients. And this is completely aside, but I found this as part of a piece of research that we're doing down in the south in Devon. And some of the other researchers attached looked at the level of carbon sequestration in different systems and found that the grassland in silvopastoral systems has the highest carbon sequestration of all different systems. So if that's a motivator, then silvopasture is a very good choice. So that's me done. Yeah, and I will just end on a Rudyard Kipling little poem from 1927, where he says, "When we bring you news from by word of mouth, good news for cattle and corn, now is the sun come up from the south with oak and ash and thorn." Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a really informative talk, and I know from my point of view, I think every sheep farmer in the country is going to be interested in the idea that trees could help their sheep, because bad weather, mineral deficiencies are the root of all evil as regards sheep, and the idea that they could eat something that's antimicrobial as well that would help their feet, every problem would be solved. So it's brilliant. First of all, I think we'll go to the farmers on the panel, because I think we have some questions, and then we'll go to the Q&A box as well. So I think, James, you have some questions, is that right?
I have. My first question would be to Jim, and it was about the carbon collecting point that he made. Is there any particular tree that collects carbon better than others, Jim?
Oh, good question, James. Not really investigated, I don't think. Lindsay might know better, but it'll be the tree that grows best, I think, on the site. You know, and I think the key in selecting a tree is match your tree to your site. So if you have wet, heavy ground, and if you have willow and alder on that, and they're growing well, they'll select carbon. Whereas if you put a tree that needed, you know, like cherry or maybe oak that needed lighter soil, then you wouldn't, it just wouldn't grow as well. I think it's pretty much related to just to simply the trees that will grow best will produce the most carbon.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll go to Will Frazer now, and Will actually works for GrowIN as well and is very active on the forum on GrowIN, finding all sorts of interesting benefits from trees for his sheep and encouraging new ideas. So, Will, I know you've a couple of questions as well.
Well, thanks, Maureen. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Just checking.
Yeah.
So yeah, not sure who it's for. Like, we're really interested in the concept here, mainly for shade and shelter for stock is the sort of big focus from a welfare point of view, and I guess sort of browse secondary to help correct some of our kind of mineral deficiencies that we think we have. But I guess the questions are kind of more fundamental at the moment. These are sort of stuff that just gets thrown back at me when discussing what we might want to do. And one of them is like, what's happened, or what's the discussion around, I guess, land values when you start to put silvopasture or trees into grazing fields or cutting fields? Does it have an impact in the marketplace? Has it been shown to have is that positive or negative, or is it not really anything to worry about? So I guess the point of view is that if you start putting trees into fields, I guess maybe the traditional perception is that devalues the asset. So that's one question. And the second question was from a dairy farmer saying that trees increase the fly burden on the stock. Is that the case? And I guess linked to that, what is the thought process on basically the stock that best, I know it's been talking sheep and stuff, but it's a stock, and then within different types of stock classes, breeds and genetics which work better within these silvopastoral systems than others. That was it.
That's just it. I'll just do the easy one and let the easy one is the first one on the carbon, because we don't really know the answer, because there's been really very little, so little silvopasture has been put in Ireland that probably hasn't had a chance to impact on land prices. But just sort of crystal balling into the future, I mean, someone asked a question there: how much CO2 equivalent is a silvopasture producing in terms of, you know, CO2 equivalents per year? And just based on, say, the 3 tons of carbon per hectare, which we were finding from the Loch Gall silvopasture, that's equivalent to about 4.5 tons of carbon per acre, CO2 equivalents per acre per year. Now, as people start to put value on that, and people start to get interested in carbon credits and the sellable value for that, you know, my thinking is, if you're producing food, if you can produce meat, a good quality meat, while at the same time CO2 equivalent of 4.5 tons of carbon of CO2 per hectare per year, or per acre per year, that's going to add value to your land. So I think there's a good chance of an upward trajectory with silvopasture, but it's just crystal ball gazing, because we know that some people, if land has been planted with trees, it does devalue that land in some scenarios, but I think that's going to change. That's my gut feeling.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I mean, I think the way everybody is jumping on I don't want to say bandwagon, because that implies that it's not a good thing, but everybody is interested in getting trees in the land, and the more established silvopasture you have, I would imagine that to hold its value rather than be devalued now with the current appreciation of what trees are bringing to the landscape. In terms of flies, well, like everything, this story is never very simple. Trees are very attractive for insects along with livestock. There is some research that's been done on flies and predator flies, or let's call them nuisance flies. With silvopasture, you do get an increase in fly populations. However, if you plant also for biodiversity, whilst you're increasing the fly populations, you're also increasing the predator populations, and that includes birds. So you need to think about bird species where you're not just supplying them with a source of food, but you're supplying them with shelter and nesting opportunities. And you're also bringing in dung beetles. So some of the work that's been done shows that you've got more species of dung beetle that are more active, and they can actually get dung into the ground 40% quicker than on open pasture. So in this scenario, they've done head counts of face flies, and what they find is that whilst there are more flies being produced, if you like, in the silvopasture system, when it's a well-designed silvopasture system and they do a head count, so they're trapping face flies, they're actually finding 40% fewer in that system than on open pasture. The problem really arises when you've got some trees, but there are too few trees for the animals that are in that system. So they're crowding around one or two trees in a field. When you've got really well-designed silvopasture, then those problems are no longer problems. That doesn't mean that the flies aren't there. It just means that they're better managed in an ecological way, if you like. For the question on breeds, well, there's some discussion back and forth, and it really depends what you want from that breed. So, for example, if you have an orchard and you're interested in grass utilisation, but you don't want the animals to browse on the trees or bark the trees, there's been some talk about some breeds barking or browsing less than others. And I hesitate to say which breeds because I think that's been over marketed. I honestly think that logically all animals will browse, and depending on their nutrient availability and also how long they are within a system, because we do know that if you move animals regularly, they are less likely to over browse and bark the trees that are in that system. So it's really about management and understanding what the animals need before looking at what you don't want them to do, I guess. Yeah, I don't know, Jim, if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, just that what we found the pasture was one way you could minimize it. In other words, a good grassland rotation, which most grassland farmers are practicing anyway, moving animals on quickly through so they're going to fresh pasture, graze it down, get them moved on. They don't interact with the trees anything so much. And if we're going to talk about using multi-species swards more in these type of systems, you're into a whole new game of really, I think, getting much more out of your pasture and swards without and minimizing the damage to the trees that animals will do.
Thank you, Jim and Lindsay. We're going to move now to Rossa Gibbons. He is in West Cork and he has silvopasture agroforestry with Shropshire sheep, but he has some questions for Jim and Lindsay as well. Go ahead, Rossa.
Thank you both, Jim and Lindsay. Really enjoyed the presentation. I had a question that can kind of apply to both you in terms of management. Let's say a farmer has his silvopasture up and running, and after 12, 15 years, the canopy is starting to close up. Is there any research done on pollarding, which would sort of keep the number of stems you have per hectare, and you'd have your fodder off your pollard, versus thinning in terms of bringing down 400 stems per hectare to 300 or 250 or whatever, thinning your stems rather than thinning your canopy?
Yep, I mean there is good. That's where the benefit of being in networks, European networks. There's a lot of work I've seen work done on the continent, in France and Holland and Belgium, on pollarding, which is a very good system in certain situations. But I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of density. You know, we aim for this sort of 400 per hectare as being the planting density. To me, that's a sort of an upper level, and you start with that and you work down, and there's no reason why there couldn't be flexibility in the system where you allow farmers to plant whatever density to achieve, but it may not happen so quickly, and you may use those trees in a different way. Coppicing and pollarding, definitely, I think we should look at, if our objective is not necessarily to produce a tall, straight timber tree, but to give the carbon benefits, the biodiversity, and the tree fodder. I definitely think there's a lot of scope for pollarding.
Yeah, I agree. And if you are looking for the tall, straight trees, well, of course, there's always shredding as well, which is maintaining the leader, if you like, the straight tree, and then cutting the side branches off, but keeping the leader going up. I think that's more risky in terms of management, requires a lot more health and safety considerations. But if you're looking for that straight tree, you can still do that and harvest tree fodder.
Okay, great. I think we'll go to some questions from the Q&A box now for a little bit. Maybe Clive, you'd start with the first one there.
I'm going to ask my own questions first.
Ask your own questions first. Go ahead.
There was just a couple of things. I'd love both Jim and Lindsay to kind of explain that image of the lack of frost underneath the deciduous tree a little bit more, or just kind of give a broader description of why that happens and why that soil temperature is higher under trees in winter. Just another thing was, I've heard that grass or pasture under trees is lower in sugars, and what thoughts you might have around that. And if you could offer any strategies, management kind of strategies or planting strategies for browse strips. And I know you've talked about it quite a bit, or different ways of offering browse rather than tree hay to animals, and how that might be managed for the recovery of those trees so that the trees aren't damaged long term and that kind of thing. And if you've come across any systems that you like and could suggest.
Do you want to go first, Jim?
No, you go, Lindsay. It's really up your street.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, in terms of protection from the cold with the tree canopy, I mean, it's really trapping that warm air in that is throughout the day. So it's keeping the warm air closer to the ground. And I'm sorry, I'm not that technical about this. I have just read elsewhere that ground temperatures under the trees, even deciduous trees with no leaf, can be up to 6 degrees higher than the open land around it. And I use that image. It was sent to me by a farmer up in the Cairngorms. It's so striking how effective that is. But of course, that that probably means that there's no low wind at this point, that it's actually quite a calm place. Because of course, if you've got cold winds blowing through, then that benefit of trapping the warm air is going to be less effective. I've forgotten the second bit that you asked.
I just chipped in a word on the first bit, because
Yeah,
I just remembered what when I was taught in class at Queen's many years ago. Big words for the answer. It'd be thermal insulation and microbiological respiration. In that, under trees, you have the tree is effectively insulating. The tree canopy is insulating the ground from the colder air above, but also microbial activity under the trees. All plants and animals, as well as photosynthesizing during the day, they respire at night. And if you have under a tree canopy, you have really active microbial canopy, fungi and microbes, and they are respiring, which means they're effectively giving off heat, and that helps keeps the soil warmer.
Fabulous, thank you. I feel informed now.
The second bit, Lindsay, was the grass under or pasture under trees having lower sugars, and how do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a logical thing, because we know sunlight and warmth improves sugar content. So this is nothing to do with trees, but there's been some research done on hay harvested early morning and afternoon, and then given to sheep, and to see which one they prefer. And they much prefer the afternoon cut hay, which has a much higher sugar content. So the more sun that it gets, the more sugar it produces. I think it's as simple as that. So the sugars are lower in plants under tree canopy, but they're not poor. They're just lower. And of course, there are other nutrients that are still maintained, such as protein and the higher mineral. And I think plant secondary metabolites also are raised. Whether they're all beneficial, I don't know. Oh, sorry, the final one was browse strip strategies, wasn't it? Was that to do with you've established your strip and then how to manage it? Oh, you've muted.
Sorry, maybe both ways. Had you any thoughts on designing browse strips, and how to manage them, I guess?
Well, I think I don't want this to sound like a cop-out, but I think it depends on what else you want these trees and shrubs to do. So if you want it exclusively for fodder, whether that's direct browse or cutting, then I would suggest something like a short rotation coppice approach might be a good approach, where you can get some mechanical harvesting rather than having to do it all by hand. Or be up in a bucket or some kind of off the ground cutting, and that might go for browsing as well as making tree fodder. The thing about managing it, I mean, you have to think about defoliation rates, and of course the big difference between trees and grass is the willingness or the capacity to regrow within a growing season as well. So you have to consider those things, and different species of trees are different in their capacity to regrow and recover within a season. The basic rule of thumb is that you don't want to cause more than 50% defoliation, because you are limiting the plant's ability to recover from that loss of foliage. Yeah, but then of course that depends on species. So if you're cutting willow, or you're planting trees that you can cut down to ground level and will grow like weeds, effectively your willows, your poplars, anything that actually is currently used as a biofuel species, then you can defoliate, for much more. So yeah, you have to look at the species, and perhaps without getting too technical, it might be useful to look at where it lies in successional terms. So its ability to regrow will be linked to where it sits in the succession.
We'll just, I think Rossa has a question there. I see a hand up, Rossa, is that right?
That's right. I wonder, I have a basic understanding of mycorrhizal associations within forest systems, and I wonder, is there any research done on mycorrhizal associations between trees and grass species, whereby the trees, rather than it being a purely competitive underground, that increased fungal communities may actually be sharing nutrients with grass species between trees and grasses.
We will not go into it a lot now, but yes, the answer is yes, in a big way. A lot of really good examples of mycorrhizal moving phosphate in particular between and the nitrogen fixing trees, for example, the grass associations with them. So I can talk about that afterwards with you sometime, Rossa, but there's plenty of good examples.
Great. We'll just, because we're kind of running over time, we'll just take a couple of questions from the Q&A, and just to remind people that all the questions have been recorded and we'll answer those through both websites over the next couple of weeks. So Mark Gray asks, has any research been done on ivy use in the forestry, and do the animals have a high interest in it?
Well, ivy is an awkward plant to consider. In historical terms, there's plenty of systems, particularly transhuman systems, where animals are browsing on ivy and are taken out to ivy patches where they browse. In our Western systems, if you like, it has a reputation for being both a poisoner and a healer. So those with sheep may have heard the old adage that if you have a sick sheep that won't eat ivy, don't bother treating it, it's going to die. And others that have had animals die from eating too much ivy. So I would say that if your animals already do eat ivy, then just be careful how much they eat. And if they don't eat ivy and you would like them to, then at least initially manage their intake artificially to avoid overeating. Anything else, Jim?
Not really, just I was in a forest in Tipperary there at the weekend. The lady was wanting to convert to silvopasture and thin it out. A lot of the trees had, it was a mature, over 15 years old. A lot of the trees had ivy, and there were a big group of people, and they all said that once you get the animals in to clear the scrubbing, they'll clear that ivy, that they love eating it. That's all. And everybody just had a positive story about ivy in that situation.
Yeah, I think potentially it's a very good source, but you have to be mindful that there are those who've had livestock die from ivy eating.
We'll take it.
I'll just ask a question for Kevin Flanagan. He has asked, is there any reference list of legume or nitrogen producing trees? Any reference stats for nitrogen per hectare per year? And any thoughts on Siberian pea trees for poultry? And I presume that's all for Ireland.
Well, I don't know about the Siberian pea trees, but sounds interesting. In terms of nitrogen story, I mean, really, alder's the only sort of nitrogen fixer that we're likely to have in the silvopastoral systems and mostly in our soils, and that's fine. And there's plenty of evidence of the nitrogen being transferred from the alder nodules into the pasture and into the animals. But I would come back to, once again, look at the understory as well. If you let's think about using multi-species swards where you have a legume component in those. So you're improving your nitrogen, your protein content to your animals from both the sward and the tree canopy. And a lot of those figures that Lindsay showed of protein and nitrogen in foliage show really good levels from trees. So you know, I think it's looking at the whole system, you could maximize your protein input.
And if anybody's got a yen to grow gorse, well, that's a very good nitrogen fixer as well. And also an old animal feed back in the day.
Yeah.
We have a question from Mark Gray, and he says, so for the grand solar minimum, do we still get the extended pasture grazing and temperature regulation?
For the what?
Grand solar minimum. So I don't know.
I don't know what that is.
I don't know,
what that is either. Okay, maybe the least slight we have or something like that.
Grand solar minimum. Yeah, okay.
We'll put that one on our list and we'll have
I'll think about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Has anybody else got any questions from the panel? That's most of our questions on our Q&A, either answered or.
There's another nice question from Mark Gray there. It's been answered already, but just for everyone, it says, what percentage of poultry feed can be realized by insects and seeds from a silvopasture system?
That's one of those things that you know instinctively is happening, but probably nobody has actually measured it very much. And the Danes have done a lot of work on poultry systems and the effect of silvopasture under poultry, and I can look back at some of that research and see Lindsay might know of. I'll just make another point that somebody brought out about old messages being important. You know, there's a lot of research. I mean, Lindsay, yes, you said it was about some research that was done 20, 30 years ago about feeding, and there's a lot of information buried there in the past that's been done and bring to the surface. Example is, you know, information on legumes and clovers. We did clover research 30, 40 years ago. Clover was researched to death almost, and we know nearly everything we need to know about clover, but it's stacked away in papers and books and things that are not easily available online and Google. And we need to go back and revisit a lot of that. And a lot of having trees and animals together, a lot of that is old research. We didn't call it agroforestry systems, but we call it things. And there's a lot of messages in there to dig out. Sorry, I just thought I'd throw in that, Clive.
Yeah, well, I mean, I couldn't agree more. Actually, the research was done over 100 years ago on the tree fodder. So it was 1917. And although I didn't mention it, the Rudyard Kipling little poem comes from his little book, Puck of Pook's Hill. And while I was reading that, there was the children in it were talking to a stockman, just a throwaway comment, but he was off to feed a sick animal with bitter willow liquid. So they must have been making medicinal drenches out of willow at that time. Never come across it anywhere else, but it was just a throwaway comment in this little story from 1927. Going back to the designs for the silvopoultry designs, I've actually got a Danish design book where there are 3 different designs that are suggested in there, which I translated a couple of years ago. I know if anybody's interested in that, I can add it to the resources.
Great, Lindsay. Actually, any resources you have, we can add them to the information and post them on the website. We're actually pretty much out of time. We've gone 15 minutes over. So I think we'll close at that. Just so everybody knows, there will be the answers to questions will be posted on both websites in the coming while. I'd like to thank our speakers tonight and our farmer panelists. I think there's been some great discussion and questions posted on the Q&A. I would also like to thank the GrowIN team for helping to facilitate the webinar, both Will and Helen. That's been fantastic. Just to let you know, you can take we're always interested in new membership. It helps us move along and helps to influence policy and also get information. And we hope our members also promote agroforestry, and that can be taken out through our website. Just to let you know as well, the slides from the speakers' presentations will be available, and I'll email those out to everybody that registered for the webinar just shortly afterwards. You can follow us on Twitter at Agroforest Forum. We're also on the IAF channel on the GrowIN site and on our own website. And of course, people can email us directly at Irish Agroforestry Forum at gmail.com. We have some farm walks coming up. Our next one is in Skibbereen in West Cork on the farm of Alan Kingston. He has silvo arable and silvopasture, and also aronia berries, our powerhouse food being farmed alongside trees. So many thanks for watching, and I hope you have a nice summer's evening, what's left of it anyway. Okay, thank you.
Bye.